Welcome to the Real News Network. Paul Jay. We're in New York City, and we're continuing our interview with Richard Wolff. He's an economist who teaches at the New School. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So in the first part of the interview, we talked about some of the factors that led to lower wages in the U.S., but we didn't get to the whole issue of unions. If I understand it correctly, somewhere just like 7.2% of workers in the private sector in unions, and if you throw in all the public sector workers, you just might make it to 11.
That's about right.
Which compares in Canada, I think it's more like 23 and 30. In Europe, the number's somewhat similar to that. What happened here?
Well, you have a union movement that focused itself and was quite successful in the first half of the 20th century in helping the rising wages, that it committed itself to winning better contracts for workers and better wages. But when a union that is successful in that area and that prides itself on that confronted what we just talked about in the 1970s, the union suddenly
looked... And just quickly, for anyone that might not have seen the first segment, what we talked about is...
the end of rising wages.
The various factors that delinked wages from rising productivity.
Exactly. So what workers quickly experienced, already starting in the 60s and into the 70s and 80s, was a situation in which wages were no longer going up, work was becoming harder, and the unions were unable to change that because the circumstances that we discussed were so massive and so global, and so there was a disconnect between the actual experience of people and what their unions could do for them. And with the hostility, particularly of certain government regimes we've had in America towards the unions, the decline of what they could do and the hostility of the political structure put together decimated the unions, and they're now very weak.
Was there also partly a factor when the money was rolling in, and for a while it was rolling in for the unions, that there's a lot of corruption. A lot of union leaders were living pretty high on the hog, and maybe lost interest in the class struggle here.
Well, there's certainly many people who feel that way, that some of the union leaders got caught up in the notion that America was a magical place that could never have the kind of crisis that we have now. I think they're very sorry at this point that the unions are not stronger than they are, because the chance, therefore, to shape what is going to be done about this crisis, which hits working people terribly, the chance of unions to shape that is very low because of their relative weakness politically and economically. So yes, I think there was some corruption, although I don't find it any greater than anywhere else in our society. But because of the weakness...
But if it's anywhere near what it is in the rest of
society, that's bad enough.
Then it's pretty bad.
That's right.
So in analyzing the crisis today, there's a lot of conversation about the financial crisis and the banks and the banking system and bad loans and Ponzi schemes and all the rest of it. And then they talk about the real economy as if they're two separate planets. What's your take on what is the nature of the crisis we're in?
Well, I think the nature of the crisis is we have an economic system that has tried to keep building without taking into account the end of the rising wages. Most of our economy depends on the mass of people consuming things. That's the bulk of our
purchasing power.
That's right. And if you take a step, as we did in the 70s, in which the employers stop raising the wages, you're plunging the population into a dilemma. It would have been possible, abstractly, for the American people, with the end of rising wages, to simply say, okay, we won't consume anymore. But after 150 years of rising, in a country that prides itself on its standard of living, the country that invented advertising as a way to get people to do even more of that, it's silly to have thought, retrospectively, that ending the rising wages would make people give up the hope to consume more. So basically what Americans did, with the aid of the business community, was to substitute borrowing for wages in order to keep the consumption going. And for 20 years, we took on a level of debt that no working class in any country at any time in the history of this planet ever did before. And the result is you built up an economy on a house of credit cards, in the sense that it could last for a while, as everyone knows who started borrowing and gotten himself or herself into trouble. At first, it all works out. It all makes it possible.
So they've been yelling at Madoff for creating a Ponzi scheme. What you're saying is the entire economy was a Ponzi scheme.
Right. That's right. He just got caught doing an even more egregious example of this sort of thing. And there will be many more, maybe not as big as Mr. Madoff. He certainly played large. But there will be plenty of others, as there have been some. When a downturn like this comes, all the people that are hustlers get caught out. That's basically what happened here. And it will happen more as this continues. But the more fundamental issue is, we've run out of ways of keeping this going. The wages are not going up, as they haven't for 30 years, and the credit is tapped out. You can't lend anymore to these folks, most of us, because we can't pay what we already owe. I'll give you just one statistic. When the Great Depression started in the early 30s, the average level of debt of an American family was about 20% of their annual income. The average level of debt of an American family today is 130% of its annual income. That very fact tells you not only the credit bubble that was created, but also the impossibility of now having some quick fix, including these big stimulus plans, because they're not adequate to a 30-year built-up level of impossibility that we have integrated into our economic system.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about what you think should be done. Okay. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Richard Wolff.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the Real News.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.